Welcome to the final theory-based video in the Gamer's Guide to Feminism series. Thanks for sticking with it. You're smarter for it. The cornerstone of many feminist complaints against gaming is cultivation theory, the idea that media can cultivate effects in consumers of media. It's one thing to say that things are annoying, bad for business, or just plain stupid, but the claim that video games can promote harmful ideas is rooted in the idea that media cultivates certain antisocial thoughts. Slight problem. Studies have been twisted to fit people's preconceived ideas. Get it? No science. Awesome, easy, video over, right? Oh, if only it were that simple. Since the 1990s, gaming has been under siege by various groups of self-proclaimed do-gooders trying to ban various types of video games with logic that ends at, think of the children. The specific things that are going to destroy our souls vary from region to region. Sometimes it's abortion, sometimes it's an alien anal probe. Different parts of the world couldn't agree on which part of South Park: The Stick of Truth was the most offensive. It's so weird that it's internationally permitted to show someone getting their brain stabbed, but you can't show a kid doing battle against a metal dildo with farts. Cultivation theory isn't an exclusively feminist concept. It's a part of communications theory, originally developed by George Gerbner and Larry Gross. The challenge with cultivation theory is that it's based on solid research, but its findings are often misinterpreted and misapplied. The common understanding of cultivation theory is that violent content makes heavy consumers behave more violently, and sexist content increases sexist attitudes. The thing is, that's not what Gerbner and Gross's research indicated. Gerbner and Gross began researching the effects of television in the 1960s. They wanted to know whether watching television influenced a viewer's perception of the real world. If watching TV did have an influence, something they named a cultivated effect, Gerbner and Gross wanted to know exactly how TV was influencing perceptions. They began publishing their findings in 1976, and certain ones were predictable using common sense. People who frequently watch large amounts of television are far more likely to be influenced by it. But that influence wasn't an increased bloodlust. It was something they named mean world syndrome, the belief that the world is a far more dangerous place than it actually is. It's important to note here that cultivation theory also states that people have to be previously inclined to believe the attitudes that television cultivates. Television is much better at reasserting the status quo as opposed to enforcing change. While media may seem to influence people towards change in areas such as African American civil rights or acceptance of same-sex relationships, that effect only occurs in people predisposed to be open to that message. Gerbner found that television was very good at mainstreaming pre-existing cultural concepts, and it was most effective in propagating moderate political opinions. Gerbner and Gross focused on television because they believed it had a uniquely central role in American culture. Millions of families across the country and sometimes around the world were having the exact same experiences at the exact same times in their homes. In other words, TV serves as a baseline for what people see as normal. Gerbner believed that television was, to modern society, what religion was to previous cultures. Television is uniquely influential because it's a daily habit for heavy users. Someone may go to a movie once a week, but they watch 10 hours of Forensic Files, 8 hours of procedural crime dramas, then binge watch House of Cards. Culture critics started soiling their shorts over video games because the increasing popularity of gaming meant that it was competing with television for cultural dominance. Activist Jack Thompson took time away from his busy schedule harassing rappers to claim that video games were a way teenagers practiced murder. 'Cause, that's totally normal teenage behavior. Hang out at the mall, listen to music, practice murdering. I think Jack Thompson watched too much TV. But Jack Thompson wasn't arguing cultivation theory. He was claiming operant conditioning, the idea that video games actively rewarded certain antisocial practices in a form of behavior modification. If that were true, kids would have been trying to jump on mushrooms and turtles way before Grand Theft Auto came on the scene. The witch hunt against violent video games in the U.S. court system came to an end when the U.S. Supreme Court decided in a 7-2 ruling that video games were not practicing violence so much as they were speech about violence. The majority opinion, written by Justice Antonin Scalia, compared video games to Gory Grimm's fairy tales and Dante's Divine Comedy. Yes, liberal gamers, Justice Scalia made at least one good decision as a Supreme Court judge. Cultivation theory became the prominent argument against video game design freedom around 2012, when the violence in video games debate pivoted to the sexism in video games debate. That's why we're talking about this in a feminist context. Now, this is also when things can get kinda stupid. So we're going to take things nice and slow. Deep breaths, everyone. And probably had an added benefit for some of you. Some studies have shown some cultivated traditionalist attitudes towards women in cultures like that of Japan that already have those tendencies. But that's with television, not with video games. With games, the research seems to say that games at worst perpetuate sexist attitudes in people who already have them. There was also a study that showed decreased empathy in teenage boys for women who were victims of violence. Teenage girls weren't affected by playing these games. This is where I'm going to pump the brakes and point something out. This study challenged the boys regarding a particular kind of empathy more than the girls. The photos they were shown after playing video games were always of a girl who had been beaten up by a boy. Boys in this study had to relate to a victim who was less obviously like them than the girls did. There are two general types of empathy that can be measured: cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to see things from another person's point of view. Affective empathy is the ability to recognize other people's feelings and respond to them appropriately. This particular study measured both types in different ways. The participants had to relate to the experience of being a victim of violence and provide specifics regarding how they felt about it. Compared to their female counterparts, male teenagers don't do either of these things well. Girls start showing increases in cognitive empathy at the age of around 13. Boys don't generally start showing an increase until around 15. The gap is even bigger regarding affective empathy. Girls show a consistently high and stable ability to recognize how someone is feeling and how to respond appropriately. Boys show a temporary decline in these skills between 13 and 16 years old. So, any study that compares empathy between the genders and includes 15-year-olds has a pretty giant hole in it. The intricacies of human development, like we just saw, are why studies done over long periods of time are necessary. We got one of those in 2015, 3 years after experts decided video games cultivated sexist attitudes, and 1 year before the flawed empathy study we just talked about. This study measured participants over 3 years and controlled for age and education level. It was the first study that took place for a period longer than a month. What did it find? Sexist attitudes were not related to the amount of daily video game use or a preference for any specific type of game. Not in men, not in women, not in anyone. So we're back to that fact that the only thing studies have consistently correlated with playing video games is a temporary increase in aggression that lasts as little as 15 minutes. This is very different than the findings regarding television that showed a profound effect in attitudes. The question is, why might this be so? Video games involve active participation and contain a high degree of player choice. They frequently strive to make the player feel powerful, or at very least capable of defending against attacks or evading enemies. This isn't the same as TV shows that show defenseless women being raped and murdered week after week after week. Many games even allow you to make the game world a freer, safer place for its inhabitants. It's less mean world syndrome. In a TV show, every viewer sees the exact same show. You can't prevent a slaughter at a wedding in Game of Thrones. A video game is a different experience for everyone who plays it. Many games have multiple character origins, starting points, midpoints, and endings. Some of the most frequently cited misogynist content in video games is completely optional. For instance, there is no requirement to kill prostitutes in any of the Grand Theft Auto games, and there isn't even a huge benefit in doing it. The sums of money required for their services are quite small. This is the point where socially conscious commentators get divided into camps that look a lot like the Assassins and the Templars in Ubisoft games. The Templar types believe in control. Gamers should not be allowed to commit antisocial actions in games because it encourages and normalizes bad acts. The Assassin types, like me, maintain that there's no emotional reward for being good if you're forced to be good, and a huge part of the immersion in video games is being confronted with choices. sometimes difficult choices. For assassin gamers, some sort of freedom of choice in a video game makes it an actual video game, as opposed to an interactive movie. The reason less socialized assassin-type gamers say something isn't a real game is because they don't feel like it's interactive enough. In-game actions, good and bad, should have consequences, but that's not the same as not being permitted to do something by the game's code. I also find that too often, games create dissonance in cutscenes by trying to create positive moral frameworks for shooting enemies in the head. Let the player struggle with that on their own. The reasoning behind the boycott threats, dog piles, and outright factional warfare against certain game developers is all rooted in the idea that problematic content isn't just annoying and lazy, it's actually harmful. Now, I guess you can make the argument that alienating certain types of players can be harmful to the sales of a game, but if that were really true, Grand Theft Auto games wouldn't be continuing to grow in sales. Regarding psychological and social harm, there's just no evidence that games cultivate any meaningful attitudes over prolonged periods. There's far greater evidence that the sedentary lifestyle connected to heavy video game consumption is what's really harmful. The thing is, I don't know any gamers who argue that sitting on your ass all day living on Mountain Dew and Doritos is actually good for you. There's a twist though. There has been a harmful attitude regarding games that's been cultivated by the media, including the gaming media. The idea that video games promote violence and sexism, and that the gaming community is uniquely hostile to women. According to Pew Research, men and women are equally likely to play video games, but most Americans, including women who play games, believe most video game players are men. Men are twice as likely as women to refer to themselves as gamers. 4 in 10 adults believe that violent video games are related to violent behavior, even though there's no proof of that. Regarding the question of whether games portray women poorly, non-gamers are split. 55% rightly have no opinion, but a full 33% of people who don't play video games believe that at least some games portray women poorly. Compare this to the survey of people who believe games treat minorities poorly. 61% of non-gamers didn't have an opinion. Only 23% of non-gamers believe games depict minorities poorly. This gap implies that the increased negative coverage of games when it comes to the treatment of women has cultivated an elevated negative opinion in people who don't play video games. Let me break that down for you again. Less than a quarter of people believe minorities are treated poorly. A third of people believe women are treated poorly. These aren't people that play games. The source of this opinion isn't actual experience. It's an opinion that the news media has cultivated. So basically, before a girl even picks up a game controller for the very first time, there's a high likelihood that she believes gamers don't want her around. Excuse me for a moment while I have a cultivated response to that. So, basically, in general, people who don't play video games have a significantly more negative opinion of games than people who actually play them. The media has created a mean world syndrome regarding video games. And we gamers can't expect better from TV news. A full 44% of those surveyed believe that video games are a better form of entertainment than television, which means gamers are much more likely to use their TVs to play games instead of watching shows. So TV news is reporting on its competition. So it's up to the enthusiast gaming press to provide coverage that accurately depicts the reality of video games and the video game community, not coverage that cultivates that mean world syndrome. Women aren't stupid. We know mean people exist in the world because we've survived the 8th grade. But if you truly want more women to play video games, you can't create coverage that makes the experience seem like the exact opposite of fun. Could you imagine other industries promoting themselves this way? Join the army! It sucks! This car is terrible to drive! Buy it now! This soda tastes like my cat's litter box! And in fact, we have data that shows that the majority of gamers are sensitive to the representation gap, and they aren't blind to problems in games. A full half of people who actually play games think that at least some games depict women poorly. There was very little difference in this opinion when broken down by gender. The numbers regarding portrayal of minorities in games showed way less consensus, with minorities actually having a more positive opinion of depictions of minorities in games than white people did. Overall, gamers were 7% more likely to have any opinion at all regarding women in games versus minorities in games. These numbers combined imply that there's been a greater mainstreaming of opinion regarding gender in video games than other forms of diversity. Cultivated effects strike again. So, those of us in the media have work to do regarding the mean gaming world syndrome we've helped cultivate. Our attempts to make gaming seem welcoming to women are lagging behind the realities of the community. By focusing too much on the bad news, we've created an artificial mental barrier to women participating in gaming. Do we need to do better representing women in games? The numbers say yes. Do we need to do better incorporating women into the gamer identity? Absolutely. I want more women to join me as identifying as gamers because any culture is most influenced by its most engaged participants. The marginalization of women in gaming includes an element of illusion, which means we can get a lot of improvement fairly easily just by reporting the facts instead of the horror stories. See you guys next time for the big finale of A Gamer's Guide to Feminism, where I get into more things we can do to make gaming more welcoming for women in terms of both perception and reality.